lot of this work most of this morning, all week. My body is feeling it, but it's a great kind of burn because I'm so excited and I've been waiting for this, and that's what keeps driving me to do this work. It's all going to be worth it. And this is the kind of effort we want and need to put in order to have the amazing amounts of food and beauty that we want to create here on our property. So now, let's wheel this over. And as you can see here, I have it roped off, the area that we plan on using as majority of this food forest. And this is what I've done in just a few days' time. So as you can see, it's not nearly enough yet. There's still a lot of work to do, so there's going to be days ahead of me doing a lot of this work. Some of the poles have since fallen down, but I generally have it roped off to give me a rough idea as to the area that I'm working within. But this is what I've laid out, and this has about at least 4, 6 or so inches of wood chips. I've been laying down builder's paper first over the grass, and then layers of the wood chips. And what that will do is create nice rich soil underneath. It'll give fungi and healthy bacteria a chance to grow, which will actually create wonderful, beautiful soil for us that will be rich come time in the spring for when I start growing these vegetables and fruit trees, berry bushes, which is what will be grown here. Down here below, we have a creek, and this is where the greenhouse is going. Which is going to be arriving here in mid-November. So the greenhouse will be going here, which is where majority of the sun comes in. A creek lies behind that runs through the rest of our property below. And this is all of ours as well. We like to keep a good majority of our property untouched, wild. All of this back here, eventually, if you can see over beyond the trees here, there's more clearing, and that is where hopefully we will intend on having maybe a couple goats and potentially doing more gardening in that area as well. But for now, this will all be untouched. However, I will probably end up growing some fruit trees and berry bushes throughout this area. And up closer to the house, I will have chickens. We have our chicken coop, the materials that will be arriving
magic hour that surrounds me with its power every night. It's hard to believe it's been 2 years since we started to build our small farm and food forest. Everything looks so different now than when we first got here. Since then, we've grown our own food, raised chickens and goats, harvested rainwater, and quickly learned that the simple life isn't so simple after all. It takes grit and determination to make it all work, but it has been worth every moment.
This is exhausting.
During that same time, we also started to work on other projects, like building compost bins. I knew I needed to start composting right away in order to have compost to use in the garden. We used old used pallets that we got from a neighbor. It takes time for food scraps and yard waste to break down into usable compost for the garden. I hope to expand my composting, especially now that I have the goats and chickens. I added their bedding and manure to the compost and created even more piles that will break down over time, giving me even more nutrient-rich compost to use. We weren't entirely sure what kind of animals to bring onto our farm, especially as beginners, but I knew that chickens might be a good place to start.
And they're off.
Plus, they are natural foragers and are fantastic at restoring land and soil, and they naturally keep the bug and insect population down. Before winter hit and before we brought them home, we started to work on building them a coop. The day we brought them home was a happy one. They were so tiny. We kept them indoors for a while since we got them in the middle of winter. Once they got bigger and were starting to jump out of their bin, I knew that they were ready to go outside. They adjusted just fine. We started with only 5 hens, but eventually added a rooster and some more hens to the flock. Once spring rolled around and all the snow melted, we discovered even more about our land, such as the crazy amount of flooding we were having in our front pasture area. We knew we were going to have to address that, and it totally crushed my vision for what I wanted to do in that area, as far as growing food, or at least it made me rethink what I could do. But I had to turn my focus onto the garden. We had a greenhouse built off-site and delivered just before that Christmas. Little did we know about the flooding we'd later experience in that area, so you know what that meant, greenhouse underwater. We kept the greenhouse there until we figured out what to do about the flooding situation, so I still started my plants in it. It felt so good to step foot into the greenhouse as the season started to change from the cold winter air to the warm sun of spring. It's always such a peaceful time to just sit in the greenhouse and plant seeds, knowing that those seeds are going to grow into a much larger plant that will eventually feed myself and my family and then become food for the soil. But my work outside wasn't done. I still needed to build my garden beds. During winter, the wood chip foundation sat, working its magic on the soil underneath, preparing it for this moment. I ordered a truckload of organic compost and couldn't have been more excited to see it delivered. I got right to work building the beds, which was a ton of work, and I even lined some of the beds with stones that I collected from nearby dunes. Then it was time to start planting the garden. I had spent months envisioning what I wanted to grow and where, learning about the plants and what grows well with what, and I ordered all of my seeds. The greenhouse was getting full, so I started to transplant everything and eventually watched my garden come to life. The chickens loved exploring the garden, so much that they started to eat my plants, so I had to kick them out.
This way, this way. Look, it's the first whole egg. Success! Woohoo!
The chickens were finally starting to lay eggs, and the garden was growing. Maintaining a garden that size, I wanted to add rain collection tanks so that I could use the rainwater to water the garden. Our home gets water two ways, through a shallow well that doesn't produce enough, and a below-ground cistern that we have to fill with city water at least once every other month. Having the rainwater definitely helps. I even got a hose and motor hooked up to it to give my back a break from carrying in pails of water to and from the garden. I even thought about how great it would be to add yet another water source to our land, so we started to do our research on digging a new well. We found some great resources on doing the work ourselves and decided to give it a try.
Hold on. Use your foot here. See that? Get ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh my God, baby, you did it. You did it, baby.
So this is actually the gravel lot where the greenhouse used to be. And this is, if you guys can see that here, that is the pipe, the well that we actually started ourselves, to put in ourselves. And we failed at horribly, but we ran into a lot of issues. Now that we had to move the greenhouse to higher ground because of flooding, I just see no reason for us to even continue to try and complete that well, because it just doesn't make sense anymore to have it there in that spot. So we're going to figure out what to do with all the gravel that's in that area now, and then just cap off that pipe, probably even cut it down and then cap it. I don't know. I tried removing it, but it's so far deep into the ground at this point that I just don't even think that's going to be possible. So I think we're just going to have to clean up the area as best as we can and give that area back to the land. With all the flooding we were getting around the greenhouse that had also impacted our well digging efforts, we knew we had to make some changes. We hired an excavator to expand the creek and storm drain. It really opened everything up. And I even started to dig my own swale down the corridor leading to the pasture. I used the dirt I dug up to create hugelkultur beds, which are self-watering beds, and I planted some water-loving trees throughout the area. I thought that this would help reduce the amount of flooding taking place around the greenhouse, but it didn't. Perhaps now that the excavation work has been completed, it will help. We're still waiting for the true test to see if it worked, which will be this spring when all the snow melts and we get the spring storms. Ultimately, we decided to move the greenhouse to higher ground. We just knew that was going to be best long term. So we had to start working on rebuilding a new foundation for the greenhouse. Earlier this year, I decided to grow my own mushrooms. I got the fresh lumber I needed and began to inoculate them. It was quite the process, taking much longer than I had expected, and we were facing rain the next day, so I was determined to get them all done that same day. We worked from sun up to sundown, but got it all done.
That is it. Oh, good save.
That same day, we got our new rooster. Our tree guy had too many roosters, and he needed to find one of them a new home. So we took him in. It took a while for the hens to adjust, but they eventually did.
Look at all of these grubs from the tree that we just cut down that we're going to give to the chickens. We're going to absolutely go nuts over these. We'll give some to the rooster. Hi, buddy. Look at these.
This year was year 2 of the garden. I added a moon arbor, and I built hoop houses for the garden. I wanted to protect my brassicas, which were destroyed by pests the previous year, and I wanted to have the option to grow year-round by keeping the plants covered under the hoop house with plastic. I added more fruit and nut trees to the garden, such as peach, pear, and mulberry.
I am planting a pear tree. I've got 2 pear trees because you need at least 2 in order for them to cross-pollinate so that you get fruit off of them. So I'm planting 2 outside of the garden, just next to it. Inside the garden, I planted a peach tree, and I'll also be planting mulberry.
I also added more berry bushes, even adding a couple near the chicken's coop. Earlier that winter, I took a beekeeping course through my local beekeeping association, so I wanted to start my beekeeping journey this year. I got everything I needed to start natural beekeeping, including a box to catch a local swarm. I wanted to catch a local swarm instead of buying packaged bees because many of the packaged bees come from warmer parts of the U.S., such as Florida and Georgia. Local bees are already used to the cold Midwest winters we get here, plus they're free. As long as you set up the right conditions and have honeybees in the area, ideally, they'd move right in. But they didn't. In the end, I think it worked out for the best because I got the worst case of poison ivy than I've ever had this year. And so even if I had caught a swarm, I would not have been able to tend to them. So it actually worked out, I think, for the best. But I'm debating whether or not to even try again next year. Now that I have the goats here and I'm managing the goats, the chickens, the garden, it's a lot to maintain, especially with it just being mostly myself. And so bees, adding that to the mix, I just don't know if it's the right thing for me to do just yet. Over the last couple years with the garden, I learned how to make my own organic chemical-free fertilizers and pest control. I first tried a neem oil mixture as a pest repellent, but then switched to Korean organic farming methods. The solutions were simple to make and inexpensive, mostly using organic plant matter and soil I already had. Plus, I could make large batches of it and have plenty to use in my gardens without having to constantly make more. There are some other things I started using more of this year in my garden too, such as urine. I know it sounds gross, but using urine in the garden is actually really good for it. Urine is loaded with nutrients, and it's free. I dilute it with water, and now it's one of my go-to ways to feed my garden. The biggest thing we added to our farm this year were goats. I had been dreaming about getting a few goats for quite some time, but it can be a big expense to set them up. There are many things you have to consider, like a shed to protect them, fencing, food, minerals, and somewhere to store their hay. I did all my research before diving into this, but there's always some things you later come across that you didn't think would be an issue. For me, it was hay storage. I thought I'd be able to store a couple bales of hay outside with no problem. I had them off the ground and covered with tarp. But as soon as we got hit with multiple days in a row of heavy rain, the hay got moldy. I had to throw it all out and run out for new bales. I moved the bales into the greenhouse since it was the end of the growing season and I didn't have any plants in it. But now we need to figure out a long-term storage solution because eventually I'll need to use the greenhouse again come spring. The day we brought our goats home, we nearly lost one. We also discovered we needed more permanent fencing instead of just relying on the portable solar electric fence I had, so we had to improvise.
This is a temporary enclosure that we put up for them in front of their shed for the time being until we can find more of a semi-permanent fencing solution around the area of the shed, just to make sure that we have them extra secure, in addition to the electric fence that we put up surrounding the whole perimeter of their area.
Winter is one of the most challenging times on the farm. Less daylight, colder temperatures, and less food for the goats and chickens to forage. Even though the garden is put to rest, the work doesn't stop. This year, we not only had to winterize the chickens' coop, but also the goats. The cold, wet weather created a muddy pen area too, so I had to lay sand down and drainage mats. One of the other hardest things we've ever had to face on our farm is the loss of one of our animals. We've lost 4 in the 2 years that we've been here. My beloved dog Hannah, 2 chickens, and a stray feral kitten that we were caring for, hoping it would hang around as our new farm cat. Predators are real and something we take very seriously on our farm. That's why we have electric fences for our goats and chickens, but you can't control or foresee every situation. Loss happens. Death is part of the cycle, but it's always a hard one to face. We've really begun to turn our home into a small, lively farm. There's never a dull moment here, and we're never without a loss of projects to dig into. Whether it's building a fire pit, making our own wood benches, setting up an extended living space, or learning how to make biochar for the garden. I never thought I'd be waking up at 5 a.m. to the sound of a rooster, tending to goats and chickens, growing my own food, or learning more about the plants around me and finding new ways to work with them. Each and every day is different, with its own set of challenges and things to be done. But as soon as I see my goats prance around me or lean into me for a hug or a rub, I light up inside. All the stress or frustration from working through the day-to-day farm work just melts away. When I see my chickens race toward me from across the land as I walk outside, or see a beautiful plant I grew from seed grow into something much bigger than me, my heart warms and I suddenly forget about everything else. It's in these little moments that I find the most magical. When a smile can completely change your mood, or when being greeted by a gentle soul can make you forget about the stress of your day. The work here is not easy, but it's worth every moment, and I still can't believe that together we have created something so sacred and so beautiful, something that will sustain us for years to come, a farm, a food forest, and a home, full of life and full of love.